where we're talking about one of the most thought-provoking discussions today, which is around decision making. Now, the way we decide, and I will go as far as saying that it determines the quality of our entire life, are decisions that we take consciously or the ones that we feel have been imposed on us, are in fact deciding the outcomes that we achieve in life, the states of emotions that we experience in life, and so on and so forth. And of course, a big part of this debate today is the one that's got a lot of attention of all of you listening in, which is Edison versus Einstein. Now, we're not historians and we certainly are not biographers, so we're not claiming to get into the history of who Edison was or who Einstein was. We are using some key moments of the lives of two of the greatest inventors that the world has seen in the last century and using it to set a context for what decision making is all about. And together can we take you into a journey where we might learn something about the patterns of decision making that get set in our own lives. So here we are, talking about Edison versus Einstein in breakthrough decision making. And to set a great context and to get this going in your minds, I thought it's very appropriate to start with and listen from these two great gentlemen by themselves. So here they are, listen in.
What do you think of the pictures today?
I think of the talking picture.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I never heard one.
What do you think of the Einstein theory, Mr. Edison?
I don't think anything of Einstein's theory because I can't understand it.
And here is Einstein himself.
Equation E is equal mc squared, in which energy is thought equal to mass multiplied with the square of the velocity of light, showed that very small amount of mass may be converted into a very large amount of energy, and vice versa. The mass and energy were in fact equivalent, according to the formula mentioned above.
So here we are, and I would encourage you to play along with us for a while and actually try and make a choice that if you could have them in your team, these two great men, who would it be? And let's begin with Edison. Edison, of course, is credited with 1,093 patents. No human being has ever traveled that journey again. No one has that many amount of patents listed to their credit, and that's Edison for you. Not only did he build so many patents and is responsible for so many inventions, but he did something a few inventors are able to do. He made successful inventions. He was able to create businesses out of those inventions. And not only that, he was able to change the world through some of the inventions. A lot of what we use today is highly dependent on the fact that Edison created them. On the other side, we have Einstein. In a recent poll conducted by Times magazine, Einstein was voted as the greatest hero of all time. That's ahead of all your businessmen, that's ahead of all the sports heroes that you see, that's ahead of Gandhi, Mandela, and Mother Teresa combined, put together. Einstein has been voted and regarded as the greatest inspiration and greatest hero of all time. And then we have Edison, who had created wealth equal to $15 billion in 1931. At the time of his death in 1931, it was estimated that that's the impact his businesses had on the world. And this figure has not been extrapolated to today's revenue. I'm talking about revenues as it existed in 1931. That's a mind-boggling number. And then we have Einstein, who was, of course, awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921. So there is no question on the intellect and imagination of the man. Edison, of course, built a successful business empire. And I think that distinguishes Edison from any normal innovator or creative thinker. The ability to construct it into a business, the ability to generate jobs, the ability to generate a company and create wealth for the future, and of course, create inventions that redefine the industry itself. And we have Einstein on the other side, who's regarded as one of the most imaginative thinkers of all time, and combined with that, a very rare skill that he actually has an IQ which is in the top 0.02 percentile of the world. Now, of course, it's not an easy choice, but I guess it gets defined by what do you really have a preference for. Do you choose the versatile imagination of Einstein, or do you choose the dogmatic brilliance of Edison? And I would encourage you to play along for a while and actually try and make a simple choice and not decide some sort of a middle path for yourself, because that's key to exploring a decision-making pattern later on. So let's go ahead. What's more important to you? Edison, of course, the tireless and practical, the persevering, the dogmatic, the determined workhorse whose tenacity and work ethic is like nobody else. He created a lifetime of experiences and experiments into a brilliant career. It's one of the most brilliant career if you read about biographies of Edison and books and case studies that are based on them and how he challenged Procter and Gamble in those times, or how he created General Electric plus 7 other companies, and how he managed the brilliant minds who were working for him. It's a case study in itself. But the crux of that case study is the dogmatic perseverance that Edison had, which is kind of unmatched. It's celebrated and it's discussed in most corporate circles or training workshops that you would come across. On the other side, you have a crazy, imaginative visionary. He would think around the corners. The world at that time, when Einstein was developing his theories, was essentially a Newtonian cause and effect world. Einstein not only challenged the Newtonian cause and effect theories, but came up with alternative theories which were good enough to pass the critics for the Nobel Prize. He made intuitive leaps, and essentially, Einstein's discoveries in the early or mid part of his careers has laid the foundation for a lot of things that happen today, including technology, nuclear energy, nanotechnology, even artificial intelligence to an extent relies on those theories that Einstein challenged. So here's a visionary who thought 50, 70, 100 years ahead. And on the other side is a man who was rooted in present, who also thought 100 years ahead, but was good enough to put that into practice to be able to create wealth through an organization. What's more important to you personally? Is it the imagination, the creativity, the brilliance of an idea, or is it the dogmatic practicality of an idea and implementation? And that's the way to probably think about this. So let's take the Edison story forward. It's a well-known fact that one of the buildings that Edison housed his laboratory in, where all his research work, his patents, lifetime of his work, employee data, everything was kept, had caught fire. One of the most devastating incidents that happened. Losses estimated during that time, and that was around $1 million. And that was a huge amount of money during that time. So everything had caught on fire, and Edison was watching this fire, and his son was running around the place frantically. And Edison called him during that fire explosion, and he called him to him is, "Why don't you go inside the house and call your mother?" And the son was confused, and he looks at him quizzically as to, "What the hell are you talking about? I'm coordinating here between different people, trying to get rid of this fire, and you want me to go ahead, call the mother? Why do you want mom here?" And Edison looked at him. "Don't you think that this is a fire that no one else will ever get to see in life? I don't want your mom to miss the experience of seeing these huge blazes and it's looking so wonderful in pink and orange." And I think that's the man there, that everything that happened, whether it's a setback, whether it's a failure, or whether it's non-success of something, the thing that historians point out, the ones who studied Edison and wrote about him, was his acceptance levels to life was exceptionally quick. He didn't brood on failure. He didn't worry about the fire. He got back into a makeshift laboratory the next day with his staff and started working on recuperating the situation, with the effect that whatever the losses was, about $1 million as they estimate in 1914, December 9, December 10, he turned it around into profits of $10 million, 1915. Now that's the tenacity of the man. The other popular story that goes around by Edison is, of course, that he failed 10,000 times in designing or perfecting the light bulb. And when the reporter asked him, "Sir, when are you likely to give up? Because it's certainly not working." And he smiled and looks at the reporter and says, "Well, I know 10,000 ways of knowing how not to make a light bulb. How many do you know?" And I think those are the kind of stories that make up the Edison files or the Edison biographies. A man full of tenacity, perseverance, a dogged workhorse. Some people may not know this, but he was the technical brains behind Henry Ford creating the first ever automobile, or at least perfecting the engines and stuff. So his contribution was not just limited to himself. It went way beyond into helping other businesses come up with innovations. A lot of modern day world, electricity and all that we see today, including the telegraph, including the phone, which is not directly related to Edison, but a work on building upon what Edison worked upon. So a lot of it around us today credited to one man who has other 1,093 patents, some of them that we've never even seen the light of. So that's Edison. On the other side, there is Einstein, who overcame a lot in his life to be even able to imagine the future that he lived. Einstein couldn't speak till the age of 4. He couldn't write till the age of 7. He was discarded, of course, as a popular story known by his school, that this man cannot read or write. He was dyslexic, so there's nothing going to come out of him. Even after completing his education, he was riddled with unemployment. He was rejected at almost every place where he applied to be a lecturer or an assistant professor. Guided by that, and that phase in Edison's life, in Einstein's life, brought about a series of mental and physical illnesses. During that period, his father, who was arranging all these job interviews with him, he had a conflicted relationship with his father. He had a conflict then taking on the authority of Hitler, so much so that all that turmoil that he'd gone through ended up leaving Germany towards the later part of his life, 1931, just about the year when Edison was passing over. Einstein came to the United States of America and then, of course, lived on there. But his troubles didn't end there. One of his 3 children suffered from schizophrenia. He had troubled marriages and troubled relationships. So he was surrounded by tragedy all his life. He was surrounded, at least in the early part of his upbringing, with a lot of disbelief in the person that he was. But he overcame all of that. Now, tragedies and things like this, normally, as you can see around you, when we hear about things like fear, when the emotional states are down, it's not an ideal state for imagination and creativity. But not for Einstein. He used that state to channel his imagination and creativity in a manner that very few people have done. And I think the greatness of the man for me lies in overcoming all that he went through, the turmoil, the disbelief of teachers, of fellow students, of not getting jobs, of unemployment, of not being able to make it, troubled relationship with parents who didn't believe in him, the country who didn't believe in him, children who eventually didn't believe in him, and to overcome all of that and to create theories and create science in a manner that he did, I think speaks great about the hallmark of the character that the man possessed of. So here we are. What's your choice? I'm not going to delve too much into the characteristics of Einstein and Edison because there's a different point that we want to get to. But to summarize this, here is Einstein and here is Edison on your screens. Einstein, who basically questioned the Newtonian paradigm, used his imagination to construct an alternate view of the world and almost could outthink you out of any situation that you're in. So that's on one side. And then we have Edison, who created new paradigms, sometimes borrowed by others, but he knew how to apply them in a very business sense or perfect them to make them applicable to today's or whatever time he lived in, those times and ages. And Edison was more of an adapter than an innovator, but nonetheless, he knew how to profit from the adaptations that he made. Now, before I go further, I encourage you in your heads, wherever you're sitting, to do make a choice as to which side do you tend to lean towards. And then we go on further and explore what does it mean for you. So as fascinating as it is to imagine that you could peek into or take a leaf out of Edison's and Einstein's thought processes, I think there's something more, or there's more to the picture than meets the eye, and we should kind of explore it. So if you hired Edison, what's likely to happen? If you hired Edison, all credit that no matter what your company does or no matter what you do, all credit will be Edison's. Now, that's not something that's an opinion. It's vouched by history. There was no patent and there was no invention credited to anybody else who ever worked for Edison but Edison himself. So all credit will always be his. He will be the poster boy. Edison's photograph was plastered on every product that went out of his company, whether it was a toaster or whether it was a phonograph or whether it was the bulb. The packaging always had Edison. He will be the brand. He will be the poster boy, or he'll leave you. So that's the price that he comes with. And then, of course, he can't listen. He's a poor listener. Not that he's a poor listener as such, but he's hard of hearing. Edison was born perfectly fine, but at the age of 10, he had an accident and he lost a majority of his hearing, and that's how he lived his life. By the way, Edison also just had 3 months or so of formal schooling. He never attended a school, so he's not educated in the traditional sense, and he couldn't listen, and he can't listen anyway, so you can't expect him to be your traditional or be a good listener or something to tell you. No, Edison's not your man if that's your methodology. Patents will be personal. There was no patent achieved by Edison's laboratory that was credited to the laboratory or to the organization or to a bunch of people or to a team. You can forget all about that. If Edison makes a breakthrough for you, it'll be patented by him. And eventually he has the business sense that he will end up owning your company. So that's Edison if you hire him. All credit will be his. He will be the poster boy. You can forget any credit. He won't be listening to your ideas. He will patent them on his own. And of course, he will end up owning you because he has the brains too. Now, if you chose Einstein, now what would that look like in modern day management terms is this. He will be unproductive. As typically as all your creative and imaginative people are, you won't be able to calculate your return on investment as a result of investing in the great man. He will have no loyalty as projected by Einstein's history to the relationships that he lived, whether it was with his children, whether it was with his parents, whether it was to his country, or whether it was to the people that he married. He will have no loyalty and he will have no hardcore feelings invested in you because you're an employer or something. He'll be an emotional wreck, as vouched by all the relationships that Einstein has had, all the people that he's worked with, and has self-confessed in his biography that he does tend to have emotional ups and downs. So a typical creative brain that you'll be hiring will have high emotional ups and downs, high maintenance kind of a person, and he was never known to be a team player. In fact, in the last years of his life, when he was offered the presidency of Israel, when Israel was being formed, Einstein's whole admission was that I'm not fit to be the president as much as I would love the job. I don't have the emotional or the people skills to deal with it. So if you hired Einstein, you're dealing with unproductive loyalty and emotional wreck and not a team player. All you get is the brilliance. So as fascinating as the choice between Edison and Einstein seem, it's suddenly not looking like a very straightforward decision, is it? You see, you come into a discussion like this, taking a peek into Edison and Einstein, and of course we get excited by imagining which side would we take, and it's a nice cognitive discussion even within one's head as to let's find out as to which way would I tilt or not. But the point that we would try and want to drive this discussion forward towards is to how we deal with these kind of situations when it comes to decision making. And one of the principles that I really want to draw your attention to today is the research that's been done on management studies, which says that our decision making essentially is bounded by rationality, which essentially means that we don't have enough information ever. No matter what the decision is under consideration, you'd never have enough information to make that decision. There's never enough time to make that decision. There's never complete knowledge available to make a decision. And of course, we are limited in our ability to comprehend whatever knowledge and information is available, and we're bounded by cognition to be able to make these decisions. And that's why it's known as the process of bounded rationality, that our decision making at an individual level, more so at a group level because we compound the problem, is bounded by information, time, knowledge, and cognition, and decision making essentially takes place as a process of bounded rationality. There is no holistic, complete process of decision making available to an individual or to management science. Now, how it plays out is this. Let's say we encounter a real world problem. So human mind, based on the limited information that it has, for example, coronavirus, we hear about it from media, real world problem, sure enough, but the kind of information that we have is limited, and based on that limited amount of information, based on the amount of time that we have to process that information, the mind essentially moves into self-preservation, avoid catastrophic consequence model, and that's the way that we get directed by. So we discover the details within the limited amount of information we have, and all that the process of decision making does is something called satisficing, which is satisfy or suffice the conditions that were set by the limited amount of information that we got. So let's take an example, or let's take a process flow as to how this actually works. There's a problem identified. Let's say coronavirus because it's current and everyone would relate to it. There's a problem simplified. So businesses have simplified that problem of economy being down. I need to preserve cash. From there, a satisficing, or which is satisfy and sufficient criteria is being set, that this is what we need to do. First, let's survive. Then let's worry about growth. And then let's worry about thriving, or whatever it is that would have been set in your mind. So identification of a problem, simplification so that the group can understand it, and a criteria set. Within the criteria, which in most organizations tends to be to preserve cash today, we identify alternatives as to, what can we do? And the brainstorming happens within that narrow set. We've forgotten about the problem. We've come to the criteria. Let's identify alternatives. Within that small sphere, people start giving ideas and we start comparing alternatives against the criteria that already been set. What's the criteria? Save cash. Is this alternative fitting into that? No. Okay, get out. So the comparing alternatives one at a time against the criteria, and a simple question at the end of it: do alternatives meet the criteria? If the answer is yes, brilliant. Select the alternative that matches the criteria. And if it's good enough, then you move it into implementation. And if alternatives do not meet the criteria, you go back to the question of identifying alternatives. Now, that's the bounded rationality decision making that we were talking about, because the problem came with a lack of information, a lack of time, lack of knowledge, and as a result, a lack of cognition, and it gets bounded into a small subset which is called satisficing, and it relates and it leads to suboptimal decision making at best. The reason we call it suboptimal decision making is because the problem has not been expanded or understood, leave alone by you or me. It's the way even the governments of the world are taking decisions. That is, problem identified, simplified, a criteria set, and now let's roll with it. For example, the government of India decided to impose lockdown on this country based on a problem identified that coronavirus might be a threat, and as a result, lives will be lost. Fair enough, so the problem was simplified. Let's lock down everybody, and a criteria was set. Hopefully, that if we lock down everyone, then the problem would be minimized and they identify alternatives, brainstorm, lockdown, announce, story over. 45 to 50 days later, we come to a situation where the economy is declining. Now, the problem shifted from loss of lives to the loss of livelihood. And as a result, the decision that is emerging, let's lift the lockdown. Now, as you can see, that the whole process itself is bounded by rationality. And that's not just an India-centric situation. It's happening everywhere in the world. That we are limited by the information knowledge that we have. We get focused on a current or a small little set of a problem, and we take a decision that impacts the whole. And then we shift that problem to the economy, for example, in the current context, and another satisficing criteria is set, and another decision can be taken, which is to lift the lockdown. Now, which one of them was the correct decision? Which one is the correct satisficing condition? It is left to interpretation, and that is what largely is happening around the world today. Now, this particular aspect is not limited to the governments or organizations. I'm talking it in context to an individual, that whatever decisions that we take in our life is determined by a certain context that we assume. The context decides which direction your brain starts to work in. It is the context that you assume, and I say it's an assumption because it's still limited by a lot of other factors, as we'll shortly see. The context decides your problem, the context decides the solution, the context decides the criteria, the alternatives, and the action, and the context is a matter of perception. How accurate our perception is defines the context, and the context then drives the decision making in the organization, as we'll shortly see. But I want to spend some time on talking about perception and context and the relationship between them. Now, there is an event or a reality that occurs in the outer world, that is real world, as things happen, whatever the reality, whatever the situation it occurs. The reality is the same for everyone. Right? There is no differentiation between you and me. The event that has occurred is the same, but the way that is treated in the human mind is probably different across all of us 7 billion people. Now, the event occurs, it gives us certain information and it gives certain stimuli for action. But how is it received by the mind? Now, there is an event that occurs in the outer world, and it interacts with the memory in the inner world. The memory is our past knowledge, our experiences, what my situation is, what my condition is. And that event interacts with the memory with what I already know. For example, the threat of life interacts with my knowledge, or the threat to my life interacts with my knowledge, and how it can impact my future and how it can impact my family, my job, etc. And it becomes essentially a threat to my identity. Identity that I am so and so, I run such an organization, I have these many kids to take care of, or this income to protect, and that identity or the threat to identity raises all sorts of emotions of anxiety, of fear, or hopelessness in me, and that in turn interacts with the intellect or the reason or the knowledge that I possess, and I start to deal with it to form certain solutions, and that essentially those solutions tend to define the character or the person that I am, and that kind of forms the final perception of things which is visible to people. Now, it's important to remember that this whole perception is driven by the context that occurred in reality and how it interacted with my memory. We can't deep dive into it. Probably we'll do another webinar sometime soon which will help you make more understanding of it. But for the time being, perception drives context, context drives decision making, and this is how it plays out in an organization. Decision making is about context, external or external. So a group of people in an organization sense will sit down and have some context to that discussion, whether it's growth, whether it's numbers, whether it's how to improve, whether it's cash flow, whether it's supply chain, whatever it is that you discuss in your boardrooms or conference rooms. There's a certain context which drives decision making. That context decides the content. So people will come together, they will debate the context, hopefully, and they will come to some sort of content as to what is the decision, and then it moves into a process as to how that will be implemented, and that kind of determines an outcome. In a very simplistic model, strategic decision making is this, that you take a context, you draw a content which is applicable to your situation, you put a process in place for its implementation, and if it's acted upon, you achieve a certain outcome. But the groups of decision making in an organization are made of different thought worlds, so to say. For example, the thought world could be sales, could be marketing, could be production, could be technical, could be operations. So people from diverse thought worlds sitting together, making sense of a certain context and arriving at a decision. But how do different thought worlds combine together to arrive at a single decision is usually some sort of a negotiated order. That it's not a straightforward discussion, there will be conflicting viewpoints, and people will tend to solve those conflicts in a certain manner and take a certain decision. Now, negotiated order or that discussion is generally guided by pressures of external demands. The popular external demands could be uncertainty, time, competition, challenge, what's happening in the market, what's happening in the world economy. Based on making sense of certain external demands, thought worlds will agree, okay, that's the best outcome to take in the larger interest of the organization, and they will come to some sort of a negotiated order. Now, these conditions itself create a perfect case for bounded rationality. No one knows uncertainty, no one knows what time pressures are, competition, challenge, they're all assumptions. However, accept the way things are, two things that a negotiated order or the finalization of the content does. It moves the process of decision making, it puts it into implementation at the cost of innovation or creativity. You can observe it for around you, that let's say even if you're sitting as a family and 4 people are trying to take a decision, at the end of the decision, there is no more room for imagination. It's straight about, let's do this thing, let's buy that thing, let's go to that mall, or let's eat that burger, or whatever it is. It moves into implementation, and the implementation drives outcome, and it's called suboptimal because the innovation aspect of it is missing. So we take a context from our perception, implement it through a negotiated order, at least as far as organizations are concerned, and it creates a certain outcome. I just want to recap the last 4 slides that I went through to come back to the point that we were making, that decision making is a process of bounded rationality limited by information, time, knowledge, and cognition. That sets a process of satisficing in place, which is satisfaction or sufficient amount of problem solving to take place, usually results in suboptimal decision making. It results in suboptimal decision making because the context itself is based on a perception which essentially is triggered by memory. Memory is past, memory is dead, memory is the time that you've already lived, it's not current, but the current context interacts with the dead context and forms certain actions. That action gives you the context which all individuals involved in the decision making are operating like that, a dead past interacting with the current reality, and they negotiate on top of it to create a certain decision making action model in an organization. And that brings us to something to study a little more deeply, which is the context effect. Now, context effect is what I really want to talk about in this presentation because it kind of determines the quality of your entire life. Context effect, in a nutshell, is the influence of environment on the choices that you make in your life. So in the human mind, there is an environment which interacts with an external environment. That environment is made up of our knowledge, of our beliefs, of our values, of all the past environment, upbringing, and how you were treated as your child, how you're being treated now. All your fears, anxieties, and all the positive things of hope and dreams and world form this knowledge and belief structure that we live by. That belief structure essentially decides your experiences. If I believe that this is what I'm wanting to avoid, for example, I might be wanting to avoid a job loss, I will create experiences in tune with that. Or you're wanting to go visit a hill station or something and your belief is that you need a holiday, then that's the experience that you're bringing into your existence. And all the sum of this, how your environment, on how you received your education, or how your upbringing was, or how your relationship with your parents was, or how you were educated, your college friends, all the environment creates a knowledge, belief, and experience structure which essentially gets etched in your memory. As a result, we come to a certain context about life itself, that this is what life is about. This is what politics is about. This is what government is about. This is what India is about. This is what nationalism is about. This is what patriotism is about. This is what leadership is about. This is what management is about. And all these experiences, collection of past, is etched in memory. And today it fundamentally interferes with perception. Now, this memory, essentially the role that it's trying to play is this. There are two things that a human mind is trying to achieve. It is, in any given point in time, either trying to avoid pain or experience pleasure. Now, take any situation in your life, whether it's the current one, you want to, let's take an example of people who are smoking or people who are used to smoking. They're essentially doing it for the pleasure that they get in the moment. Now, when will that habit kick off? That habit usually kicks off in people, as research tells us, is when there is a serious illness or when they have a heart attack or something, because now the pain has become greater than the pleasure. Avoiding pain is the task effect. Of course, the end result that we are all after is experiencing some sort of a pleasure, and that's the goal effect. And the entire circle of life happens between these two experiences, or whether I'm avoiding pain or whether I'm experiencing pleasure. Now, deep dive into your mind for this. All your actions, almost everything that you do on a daily basis, as an individual, as a family, as an organization, is either of these two things: avoiding pain or experiencing pleasure. And research in neuroscience tells us that avoiding pain tends to be a far greater motivator for people, unfortunately, is what I would say, than experiencing pleasure. All our actions, majority of them, are directed towards avoiding pain, and achieving pleasure is almost always a futuristic state. So, for example, cash preservation in businesses today is to avoid a certain pain that will happen so that you can receive a certain pleasure by using that cash in the future. Avoiding pain is the immediate task that people deal with, and pleasure is a futuristic goal. And that essentially is a context effect, that our entire context in life, when it comes to moments of decision making, comes down to whether I want to avoid pain in the present moment, or I want to direct it towards experiencing some pleasure in a future moment. And this pain and pleasure interaction is essentially setting the context for our decision making today. That's the context that we live in, and that's what we mean by context effect, which is defined as the influence of environmental factors on our perception. There is an environmental factor, a reality in the outer world, and that is impacting my perception in a manner which kind of drives decision making. So what is driving my decision making today is not the fact that there is coronavirus and that problem needs to be solved. What is driving my and your decision making in your life today is how your life or my life might be impacted or threatened as a result of that. We don't really care what happens to coronavirus or not. As long as we can manage making our end meet and figure out an economic solution to that, you and I will be pretty happy if we're not coming in contact with the virus. So we're not worried about the problem. We're not worried about what happens to 1 million people who die. What we are essentially worried about, the influence of this environmental factor, how it's interacting with my mind and perception, and how it is going to deal with my pain, and how it is going to deal with my pleasure. Now, there is a context effect, and there is something that we call the core context effect. Every individual who is living today, who is alive or has ever lived, has something called a core context effect. That is a certain environmental factor, an incident or experience which may have occurred in an individual's life, and this environmental factor has a repetitive effect on perception. It becomes a repetitive pattern on perception, and I'm going to come back to taking two examples from Einstein and Edison's life, and you will be able to relate to them because I'm amplifying them with the help of these glorified cases. However, when you listen to these stories, you might be able to reflect upon your own. So let's begin with Einstein. Now, what is the core context effect? We say that's something that has a repetitive effect in perception, and these are usually the 5 psychological stages that the core context gets formed. The first stage is a certain story that occurs in a person's mind and kind of influences a feeling of pain. So Einstein's story growing up was, as we discussed a little while back, that Einstein couldn't learn properly until the age of 7. He couldn't write. He went in school and he was ridiculed in school for being a suboptimal kind of a student who's never going to get anywhere in life. Now that's the psyche with a little kid up to 7 to 10 years of age is growing up. Constantly throughout his life, he was dyslexic, not understood as a condition in those times for sure. Very little about it is respected even today, so you can imagine those times. And that's the story that Einstein grew up with around his peer group, around other kids in school, around his home, where everyone constantly treated him as someone who's suboptimal, and that's the pain that he essentially lived with. Combined with that, Einstein's story is also of a very troubled relationship because this father viewed him as this useless guy who's growing up, and what the hell is he going to do about his life? So the methodology that the father adopted with Einstein was to be very strict and even more harsh on him than the school itself, and that inflicted further pain. Now that pain, in a very psychological sense, drives a sense of purpose in the human mind, which is the opposite effect, that I want to avoid this pain, as we discussed in the previous slide, and move to a pleasure, and the pleasure must be the opposite of pain. That's how the human brain essentially thinks. Good is the opposite of bad, tall is the opposite of short, so something, if I have to get rid of the pain, I might need to do something opposite, and that opposite essentially becomes the purpose, that can I change the minds of how people view me from this disrespect and disdain to absolute charisma or whatever it is, and that purpose then drives our decisions. And that's the story of Einstein, isn't it? That there's intense pain by the way of ridicule. There is intense purpose to overturn it, and that kind of drives the decision, and that decision essentially becomes about redemption of pain. Now, to take a few examples from the story, Einstein's father found him about 10 or 12 job interviews, which is as biographically mentioned. Einstein failed in all of those job interviews as a lecturer or as an assistant professor, couldn't find those jobs. Now, those jobs intensified the pain. Einstein writes in his book, at the peak of his unemployment struggles, he contemplated suicide many times. As a result, he suffered from mental and physical illnesses. He had a most troubled relationship with his father. He has letters which are dated in this biography during that time where he contemplated suicide, ran away from home multiple times, and finally Einstein found a little insignificant job at the patent office, and from there on the rest is history. He learned the process and figured out how to get patents and all that. But the larger point is that the whole story signifies a psychological journey of as brilliant a mind as Einstein. And take the story forward. Hitler takes over the control of Germany and becomes this national father figure, so to say, as we can see happening in a lot of countries around us, including ours. Hitler takes away as this national father figure in Germany. Einstein's memory and his core context of an environmental factor tells him that the father figure causes him pain. And without any provocation in those days, Einstein starts challenging Hitler. He starts challenging Hitler, so much so that that conflict is got up to a certain stage, and of course there can be only one winner in that conflict, and eventually Einstein has to flee the country and he reaches United States. He reaches United States. Now it becomes far easier to challenge Hitler because the pain-purpose decision has that opposite effect always in life, no matter how evolved or how wise you go on to become. So Einstein reaches United States of America and launches an all-out attack on Hitler through press, through articles, through this or that. Nothing seemed to be working from 1931 to 1939. Again, another steep rise in the effect that Hitler had on Germany and the world at large. And finally, in 1939, Einstein writes a letter to President Roosevelt, which was that Hitler in Germany, whether it's true or not, it's highly debated, the fact of it, not the letter. He writes a letter that Hitler in Germany is producing the atom bomb and America should do something about it. Based on this letter, based on the credibility of a Nobel Prize winner and a respected citizen of the world, Operation Phantom was launched to create atomic bomb for United States of America. The rest is history. It ended the World War. Einstein, till date, is debated whether he was a part of the Operation Phantom or not. We don't know, but E is equal to mc square was certainly a part of that formulation. The point I'm making is this. There's a core context effect that exists in that brain, in my brain, in your brain. It creates pain, it creates purpose, it creates decisions. The end result of it is redemption. And in Einstein's case, of course, it brought him the greatest glory that the world could have seen. But it also went to the extent of contributing to create an atomic bomb or create the nuclear bomb, to create a redemption of sorts. Germany, by the way, the atomic bomb story was as true as the story of weapons of mass destruction during George Bush's time. So there's no truth in that story. So we can forget about that. It's validated by history. But that's the effect of the core context effect. Now, the last article ever that was published from the memoirs of Einstein was this, that he deeply regretted the contribution that he made to Operation Phantom, and he deeply regretted the contribution that he's made to creating advancement of science to be able to create a nuclear bomb. It doesn't work out in the end, but the idea behind giving you this story is to figure out there is a core context effect that drives all individuals. There are certain environmental factors that get etched in our mind, which colors our perception of context. And let's take one more story before I delve on it further. Edison had a similar story to Einstein. No formal schooling. He was chucked out of school because he was hard of hearing. His mother, to protect him from abuse of other students, educated Edison at home. So again, he had a relationship with the external environment, which was one of ridicule and lack of purpose, so to say. He had no friends growing up, so he had this intense pain as a result of missing out on the normal norms of life. That led to a purpose that I have to do something to be able to get the adulation and admiration of others. And of course, in Edison's case, again, it directed all his decisions in life and of course redeemed him as well. But it led him to do certain things which normal ordinary lives won't do, which was an extreme need to get credit, an extreme need to be the center face of everything, extreme need to plaster his photograph on every product and stuff, extreme need to hawk the patents which might have been created by other people in his team. Edison, in fact, wasn't even the inventor of light bulb. Of course, it's a well-celebrated effect that Edison invented the light bulb. The light bulb was invented by two gentlemen somewhere way back in 1860. Edison bought over the patents, transferred it in his name, and the patent of Edison that essentially belongs as a light bulb to Edison is to perfect it to last 12 hours. It's not to create it. So against all the credentials that exist to disprove, Edison created a story because of his core context effect, which was essentially to live an opposite life. Core context effect determines everything that we do in our lives. What is your core context effect? Because that colors the perception of context. For example, if I have a fear of poverty, let's say, then I'm looking at the situation that is happening today and driving a certain context in my life, in my organization, which is driving the entire decision making. If I have a context that I want to be proving to the others that I'll be bigger in size, then no matter what the external reality is, the lens that it interacts with is my context. My context could be that I want to protect my sense of security, and no matter what happens outside, it could be coronavirus today, it could be a death of a close relative tomorrow, or it could be a very positive thing that happens outside, which could be someone else's celebration or something. It will interact with the core context, and I will derive my context based on my core context, not based on reality. Whether it was the financial crisis, or whether it's changing of Manmohan Singh government to Modi, or whether it's coronavirus, or whether it's something happening between US and China, if you notice how it interacts with your core context, it's almost similar every single time. Whether it's a good news or bad news, you want to convert it to your core context and deal with it. And that's the danger, because in the end, the life is spent on redeeming it and not on living for what actually is. So you can be an Edison, you can be an Einstein. The core context effect doesn't escape you. It's the central thing in life which colors the perception and drives this goal of pain or pleasure, and that in turn drives our entire decision making in life and determines the quality of our entire lives. Success or failure will happen. Yes, there are positive things associated with the core context, and I'm not debating it, but whether it's a positive or it's a negative, it's still a concept that's interfering with the actual perception of things and coloring the process of decision making, not just for you and me, but for the people that we hold the ability to influence. So what's your decision? Having listened to the earlier part of the presentation where we were celebrating Edison and Einstein, to the latter part of the presentation, which is essentially pointing out to certain psychological effects that exist in every human being. What's it going to be for you, for Edison or Einstein? They're both dead. There is no Edison and there is absolutely no Einstein alive. Their relevance was in 1930 to 1940, whatever it is, and that was the relevance. They are gone. What is it that you were doing comparing yourself to Edison or Einstein? What's your redemption? How is the story of Edison or Einstein interacting with your core context? When we say Edison or Einstein, or when I'm giving you the choice, which one would you like to have on your team? Which context is it solving for you? Which context is it redeeming for you? And why so? What is the pain that it's answering for you? What is the pleasure that's answering for you? And that's your peep into the kind of pattern of the core context that we are talking about. Two people are dead, and if we are living in their memory and we are getting guided by the context of our pasts, of dealing with the pain and pleasures of our past, aren't we really living a dead life ourselves? And I really want to ponder on this question for me and for you, that we are allowing a certain context that exists in memory which is past and dead anyways, and we are deriving and constructing an entire understanding of our life and our future and future of people associated with us through a context which is essentially dead. Einstein and Edison are dead. They don't exist. They're never going to be alive again. They're not going to come and work for you. There is no association of Edison or Einstein or both that you would like to hire. What is your present moment? What is your core context is going to define your decision making, and it may be better or worse than Einstein or Edison combined. What's your reality? The context gives you a certain outcome. The outcome is a result of what do you see in reality? Am I seeing the reality, or am I seeing my context in the reality? And that's one of the most significant principles or questions of critical thinking that I could point you out to. What do you see? What do you see essentially without you in the story, without your story, without the pain principle, and without redemption? What do you really see? The reality is something else completely. You are fed a reality by media. It interacts with your context. It gives you occupation, and we start believing in it. Is that the reality, or is it something else? And what would enable us to see the reality in the first place? Forget making a decision. What would enable you to actually see the reality is the ability to observe your context and put it aside. And can you observe the reality for what the actuality of it is without you being a part of it? Do we have the freedom to see it? Do we have the freedom to act in it and not get outcome defined, but get defined by actuality? That actuality is that business is in trouble. That's an actuality. Outcome is that you want to save cash. Those two may not be related if you remove the context. And the reality is determined by that context. And I want to point you out towards the end of this presentation, towards a certain mechanism that you could go through certain questions to be able to clarify this context for you. And the first of it is, what is the critical issue in place that you are dealing with before even you are wanting to make a decision? What is the non-core context effect for you in your life or your business? And the first critical question to be asked in that effect is there even a need to make a decision? Is there any action required? Who are the people who actually need to make a decision? Does it even need management of people? Now let me put this in perspective with an example. Let's say, yes, there was a need to make a decision. Once as a decision maker, you've made that decision. Do you need to make it 55 times over? Is there action required 55 times over? Who needs to make that decision 55 times over? And does it need management of 50 people 55 days in a row to be able to drive that decision? Are you dealing with dumbness or are you dealing with an organization? The reason behind people investing so much time and energy on a certain narrow context is because it interferes with their core context and not because the reality of the situation demands it. Can I put the non-core context, can I put my core context effect aside and look at a situation that what is the reality that you are dealing with? Are you dealing with coronavirus? Are you dealing with economy? Are you dealing with loss of business? Or are you going to deal with what is needed to come out of it? I think the core question itself amongst people is not answered and they're going about this hectic, maddening activity which has no end in sight. So the first question really is, what is the critical issue that you're dealing with? And the second question is, does your environment support the right decision? It could be your family, it could be your ecosystem, your organization, your colleagues, your workforce, whatever it is. I think what we fail to recognize the importance of the first question on the screen. What is the real issue? What are you trying to accomplish and why? We get into the mistake of this maddening action orientation, hectic decision-making activity without answering a fundamental thing. What is it that we are trying to do through this decision? Because the assumption of context is so powerful in our minds as a result of our context and perceptions that we assume the real issue. We process information in context to the real issue and we really lose sense of what the real issue is. What is the real issue that you are trying to accomplish? What is it that your business is trying to solve? Is it trying to really solve a problem which is going to be there for 3 or 4 or 6 months? Or is it going to try and solve a problem that actually exists outside as a result of which your prolongevity is going to be ensured? What is it that you're trying to do? And if you don't answer it, you end up with a false assumption of all the next questions to follow. What are the specifications of the solutions? What are the requirements? All these questions you can go through in your teams. I'm not elaborating fully here. Have you considered the range of alternatives and steps to be meeting the decision? And all those questions become relevant when you're able to answer the fundamental question, what is the real issue you're trying to accomplish? And if you don't go to this fundamental concept or this fundamental question, the mistake you will make is this. As we discussed in the core context, there will be a certain story which is playing in your mind, which has already defined a sense of pain and an opposite purpose, which is already guiding your decision making in life, and it's already about redemption. Every single context in life is going to fit that story. And that's why scientists and neuroscientists say that human beings are about repetitive patterns, because we're never able to see through the story. So I examine you to look within. I want you to look within and examine the reality for what it is. Get over your context, put it aside so that these blinders are removed and we see the reality and we move to a real test of will and character. And these are the questions I really want to end this session with. Are you willing to opt for the boldness? And the boldness requires me not as an opposite of fear or something. Boldness requires me to confront myself, question the core context that me and my organization or me and my family or me and my friends have assumed to be true, so that we can see what's really beyond it, what's really the reality of it, what's the actuality of it. You see, what is the actuality that India is dealing with? Is it death or is it economy? I really don't know. And that's where I say that the context interferes with perception, because if the context is lives, then it hasn't been dealt with. If the context is economy, then lockdown shouldn't have been imposed. And I want you to just point at this is such a circular flaw in the way of our reasoning itself, which is this bounded rationality principle, that what is it that we are really trying to do? Does your need for a decision deal with an actuality, or does it deal with a personal motive or intent? And if it doesn't deal with an actuality, it's not going to solve the problem. And does the decision automatically create action? I think the test of a right decision in life, at least at a personal level, is this, is does the decision automatically create action, or do you have to still force people and yourself to do something? And if it's by force, then it means people are sitting on different contexts and they haven't seen the reality and the reason is the reality is common for everyone. So the reality doesn't change, it's the perception changes. And if people hasn't seen through the reality, they're still sitting in the context. And a very key question to ask yourself is, if you've got it wrong, who in your surrounding system is going to tell you that, sir or madam, you're terribly wrong this time and this is not going to work out? And I think you can go through these questions later as a team, because these slides are going to be with you. But it's essentially to go through it and summarize for yourself as to what is driving your context effect. And I want to summarize this again for you, that the environment, structure of belief, knowledge, and experiences that we go through in life become etched in memory in the form of a story that we live in. And then the entire mechanism of pain and pleasure comes into existence, which is avoidance of pain and experience of pleasure. And that core context effect drives every single decision making, big or small, in our lives. And we get lost in this issue of redeeming pain with pleasure. And we never are able to see the reality of things, and life becomes a repetitive pattern. I invite you to take a deep, hard, personal look at this in your life and figure out where your core contexts lie, how that determines the quality of your life, and what can you do to be able to come down and come out of it into the current moment so that you can see actuality of things. And when we do, the need for action becomes absolutely clear and apparent, and there's no need for motivation left as such. So Edison versus Einstein was not as much about Edison or Einstein as much I hope that I've been able to convey that it was about you, the person, and we were using Edison and Einstein as stories for us to understand the mental and the psychological makeup of human beings as far as decision making is concerned. Cheers, and thank you for listening.